than giving a campaign speech to an audience that he has to reach and is critical for him going into this election. But I'm curious as to your reaction.
So I think those are all really important points. And I think that Biden has to reach Black voters. I mean, that is going to be the only way he keeps his presidency. So I think that's really important. Biden has, one of the things that I was struck by, that I was happy that he talked about, was the reason that he exists, the reason that he is president now is because of Barack Obama. Right? So, and what I think that he does that is smart but also important is that he is really, you know, when he made that connection between being the standard bearer for Barack Obama and then being the sort of placeholder for Kamala Harris, that I thought was more of the kind of stuff I would have loved to have seen. I was glad that he announced the $16 billion investment in HBCUs. That is a big deal and important. And a lot of these colleges have these enormous endowments that some of these other colleges don't have. So I think that's really important. And I definitely think his nod to peaceful protest as someone who comes, you know, my grandfather was jailed by this country for his political beliefs. So I do think that peaceful protests and his agreement and the protesters in the audience were very respectful. And they had, you know, they used symbols from, you know, civil rights that are really important, and then that you had these faculty members with the Congolese flag. You know, this is a very politically engaged audience, which is quite good. Look, the campaign stuff, I agree, it's distasteful, right? It's just distasteful, and the reality is, but again, I think that I think they're worried. I mean, I think this administration is concerned because of the stakes of this election. But I agree, you know, Morehouse is hallowed ground and this is distasteful. But I also think, like, he's in an impossible situation.
I think you are correct. He is in a very precarious situation. But it's important to understand it's one of his own doing, in the sense that you've had 4 years before this point to make your case. And so this hurried sort of response is something that I think reflects more on not figuring out messaging before now. Because let's be fair, the evidence and the substance, you can make the record or make the argument that the record supports that. And that's fine. You can make the argument that the record supports, you know, Joe Biden having had a very successful presidency. The evidence is there. The issue is that the messaging
is not.
And you've gotten to this point where you've had 4 years to figure it out and you haven't quite struck the right tenor. And so now you're in a space where you have to make these decisions. There were a couple things that I heard during the speech that hit me, particularly as a Black man. One of them was he talked about Black men being in a space where they love America, but their love for America is not reciprocated to them in equal measure. There's also a part where he talked about creating an America where, referencing police reform and George Floyd, which I don't know was the appropriate tenor in terms of to invoke the notion of George Floyd at that point in this conversation on their commencement. I understand it. Again, I don't know that that was the right move. He talked about creating an America where Black parents don't have to have the talk with their children. As a Black man, I have mixed feelings about that. And the usage of that, because the question becomes, I appreciate the policy. I appreciate the reference and the nod to Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. I appreciate the reference and the nod to President Obama and to Vice President Kamala Harris. But when you start campaigning on that stage in this moment, and using this type of language, the question for me becomes, all right, so what are you going to do?
And no, listen, these are all really important points, and it's really good that we're talking about it because you and I are both very much on the same page about a lot of things. I do think that there is, I don't know, you know, I'm struck by, like, having Ketanji Brown Jackson is an amazing Supreme Court justice.
It's a very big deal.
And she's also just incredible. And, like, we've seen over the last 4 years, we've seen a lot of times where I have seen just how racist and misogynistic this country is in a baked-in way. Mm-hmm. Remember her, the kind of attacks she sat through, and then she's turned out to be, during oral arguments, you hear her and you're like, this person is much smarter than most of the other people on this. I'm struck by a lot of points in this speech. I do think, look, there was a sort of, he did it, and it was important. And by the way, it really got built up as as sort of one of the bigger news moments, which I think is both good for Morehouse and good for Biden. He gave a speech. It wasn't perfect. He's not a gifted orator, right? We know this, but he did it. There were a lot of good things in it, and his commitment towards trying to right the incredible racism and in this country is I think it's sincere. Now, can he do it? I don't think so, but he is trying.
In some ways, it reminds me of, in terms of, you talked about the buildup, it reminds me of the 2007 speech that Barack Obama had to give in Philadelphia on the notion of race, in terms of how that was built up. Yeah. The difference is that this is a commencement. Right? And that's the sort of key. I want to bring in right now April Ryan. She's the White House correspondent and the Washington bureau chief for The Griot. She's also an MSNBC contributor. April, good to have you. So you just heard the speech. Molly and I have been talking about this notion of a commencement speech versus a campaign speech. I want to just get your initial reaction to what you heard in our conversation so far.
Well, I greatly differ with Molly. I respect her opinion, but I greatly differ. I interviewed the president of Morehouse prior to this address this week. And he said he did not believe that there would be any protests. He said he did not believe that the students there would risk zip ties and be taken out. But there were peaceful protests. From the beginning, when the president stood up, you saw the Congolese flag by faculty members, faculty and staff of the university. That signified that there needs to be a focus on Congo, the atrocities that are happening in Congo. Then if you look in the crowd, yes, the president ticked off all of his messages about his positives and what he's done for Black America. But there was clearly an understanding in that crowd of Black men, of family members of all walks of life, who understood the oppression by groups of people. You had people who were wearing the Palestinian liberation scarf. Okay. And you had people who turned their backs. We clearly saw that. You saw one faculty member. I don't even know if it's a faculty or student member, but it was someone standing in the back with their fist up. So there was clear protest that the president saw. People with their backs turned, people with their heads down. There was clear protests, peaceful protests in this moment on this sacred grass, on this sacred ground called a Centennial Campus. And the president told me the reason why it's so sacred, and he did not expect that to happen, I'm talking about the president of Morehouse, because of the sanctity and the sacred nature of that campus. The only time the students walk on that campus is for graduations and when there was a eulogy for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
April, I want to follow up with you there. I talked about the notion of this being sacred ground. And I do agree with Molly in as much as there is somewhat of an untenable position that President Joe Biden was in as much as if you go into that space and you don't touch any of the political implications of everything swirling around him in front of a key voter demographic, it's possible that you miss a key opportunity. Is there ever any room? Do you think that there was any possibility that he could have found a better balance in his remarks at all? Or is it just kind of sort of, between a rock and a hard place around his decision in terms of which way to go?
So walking into this, the president clearly knew that African Americans are not as strong for him in this election as they were the last. And he had to tick off his messaging about his positives. But he also had to talk about the Hamas-Israel war, where the Palestinians are being harmed humanitarian-wise and also by death. But if the president, if I were his speechwriter, who could have expounded a little bit more on the issue of Palestine, because that was a lot of the crux for a lot of the argument there, a lot of the protest. And Jake Sullivan, earlier in the week, he talked about the Palestinians. He said, you know, they're living in hell. We can go back and play that tape from the briefing room. He said they're living in hell. Not only are they living in hell, he said there needs to be dignity and the aid needs to go there. And I think if the president would have put a little bit more into it, people would have felt a little bit, it wouldn't have been as, I don't know, there was still protesting there. And I think the people there would have left with a little bit more like, okay, this is where you are on Palestine. And yes, he called for a ceasefire. And so did the valedictorian. But lean in a little bit more on Palestine. And let's see what happens also this evening when he goes to Detroit, because I'm hearing when he goes to the NAACP, it's not going to look good as well. At least this president is willing to go into the fire. Right. Dearborn, think about this, Muslims as well as Arabs in that community who are very upset. And so today is going to be a day that he walks into the fire and he faces off with Black America. And he is seeing, and this is what he might need to see, the fact that they have turned their heads and they're putting their heads down and they're raising their fists because they want more. It's not about words, it's about...
I want to ask you for your thoughts on that, but I also want to ask, he did touch on, as you noted, the notion of supporting peaceful protests. What type of response do you anticipate that will be received from other protests across college campuses and that demographic? Most people are going home for the summer, but if you hear that, and you're someone who was in a protesting camp on a college campus, how do you think that response takes place? I just want to respond to April because I don't think we're disagreeing. I mean, I don't have the insight into what it is like to be in an HBCU or the history of Morehouse, but I don't disagree with her that, you know, there are serious protests. He has work to do. And I think he knows that, which is why, you know, he's going and trying to do the work. Now, can he do it? I don't know. That I can't speak to. But I do think, look, would you rather have a president who says, you are entitled to peaceful protest, which is in the Constitution, or would you rather have a president who says lock them up, which is Donald Trump? And I mean, this is the choice, right? It's a binary choice. We don't get to, you know, there's not like some other candidate who is going to be president. So I do think peaceful protests, we have a long and storied history of peaceful protests. They happened today. You know, there was some real, I thought, meaningful protests and, you know, and it was not disruptive and they did it. And like, they have a right to do that. And honestly, I'm proud to live in a country where that happens. So much to unpack. Thank you very much for having two of the best to do it, Molly Jong-Fast and April Ryan. I appreciate you both. We are continuing to follow breaking news out of the Middle East. Iran state media is reporting that a helicopter carrying the country's president, Ibrahim Raisi, suffered, quote, a hard landing earlier today. Iran's foreign minister and other officials were also on board. The helicopter was flying in a remote mountain region and a search and operation rescue mission is reportedly underway. However, those efforts are being slowed due to fog and the remoteness of the location. Raisi's status is currently unknown. We will have more on this breaking story as we know it. And still ahead, another quid pro quo. Why is Donald Trump's billion-dollar pitch to big oil execs sparking a congressional investigation? I'll ask Senate Budget Committee Chair, Democrat Sheldon Whitehouse, when we return after a short break, right here on Velshi.
If you have chronic kidney disease, you can reduce the risk of kidney failure with Farxiga, because there are places you'd like to be. Farxiga can cause serious side effects, including ketoacidosis that may be fatal, dehydration, urinary tract or genital yeast infections, and low blood sugar. A rare life-threatening bacterial infection in the skin of the perineum could occur. Stop taking Farxiga and call your doctor right away if you have symptoms of this infection, an allergic reaction, or ketoacidosis.
Nothing dims my light like a migraine. With Nurtec ODT, I found relief.
The only migraine medication that helps treat and prevent all in one.
To those with migraine, I see you.
For the acute treatment of migraine with or without aura and the preventive treatment of episodic migraine in adults. Don't take if allergic to Nurtec ODT. Allergic reactions can occur even days after using. Most common side effects were nausea, indigestion, and stomach pain.
It's time we all shine. Talk to a healthcare provider about Nurtec ODT from Pfizer.
My daughter is Mila. She is 19 months old. She is a little ray of sunshine. One of the happiest babies you'll probably